The debrief room smelled like recycled air and burnt polymer. It always did. Lieutenant Callum Voss sat with his wrists resting on the table, fingers loose, the way a man sits when he's decided not to be afraid of anything anymore. The alien across from him, pale blue dermis, 4 optical lenses arranged in a quadrant pattern where a human would have eyes, stylus poised above a translucent data slate, had introduced itself as Assessor Renkal of the Imperial Psychological Directorate. It had a voice like a synthesizer trying to approximate sincerity. "We will begin," Renkal said, "at the beginning." Voss looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked at the assessor the way you look at a door that's about to break open. "You probably shouldn't have asked for that." But he told it because that was the deal. Because 47,000 humans were still alive on 3 occupied worlds and the terms of the ceasefire were simple. 1 soldier, 1 debrief, full psychological assessment, full battlefield testimony. The Empire wanted to understand what they had fought. They needed to classify it, put it in a box, give it a threat rating and a strategic countermeasure. That was how the Vethel Empire operated. Everything went into a box eventually. Voss had spent 18 months making sure that every box they tried to put his people in was the wrong shape. "Start with your unit designation," Renkal said. "7th Asymmetric Operations Group," Voss said. "Callsign Schoolhouse." "Schoolhouse," the assessor repeated and wrote it down. "An educational institution. Why that designation?" Voss almost smiled. "Because that's where we all came from." 3 years before the debrief, the war had not yet begun in any formal sense. The Vethel had been watching humanity for 11 years before they moved. They were methodical. They studied. They cataloged every military doctrine, every weapons system, every command hierarchy. They watched humanity's generals give speeches. They watched humanity's admirals shuffle fleets. They built elegant, mathematically precise models of how human beings made war. Then they attacked in 17 simultaneous theaters and were genuinely surprised when none of those models held. But that surprise came later. In the beginning, it went the way the Vethel expected it to go. Callum Voss was 26 years old and 3 weeks out of his second stint in a psychiatric rehabilitation facility when the first Vethel ships broke through the orbital defense grid above New Bremen. He was sitting in his therapist's waiting room, reading a brochure about coping strategies for intrusive thoughts, when the wall screens went white with emergency broadcast light. He watched the footage with the other patients. Nobody said anything. An older woman with trembling hands reached over and put them on top of his. He let her. His therapist, Dr. Nadia Osai, found him still sitting there 20 minutes later when the waiting room had emptied out and people were running in the corridors outside. She was a small woman with natural hair and reading glasses that she was always forgetting on her forehead. She sat down next to him and looked at the screen. "Well," she said. "Yeah," he said. "How are you feeling?" He thought about it honestly, which was something she had spent 8 months teaching him to do. "Ready," he said. She looked at him sideways, not with the professional regard she wore during sessions, something else. Something that might have been recognition. "Callum, you've been medically discharged. You are not cleared for active." "I know." He stood up, straightened his jacket, picked up his bag. He had been carrying it every day for 2 weeks, packed and ready, without knowing why until now. "But they're going to need people who don't scare easy." "That's not what your file says about you." "No," he said. "My file says I scare exactly easy, but it scares me different than it scares other people." He looked at her. "That's what you told me, remember, in session 6. She didn't say anything. She took her glasses off her forehead and cleaned them on her sleeve. It was the thing she did when she was trying not to say something. He left. She watched him go. Neither of them knew then that the specific texture of what was broken inside Callum Voss, and 6 other people like him, would eventually become the most tactically significant variable in a war that would cost 40 billion lives, and end with an alien empire asking a human soldier to explain himself. The 7th Asymmetric Operations Group was not created by any general. It was created by a logistics officer named Major Priyantha Mendes, who had been tracking anomalous battlefield data for 11 weeks and had noticed a pattern that made her very uncomfortable. Humans with certain documented psychological profiles were surviving at rates the casualty models couldn't explain. Not thriving, not winning, surviving. Doing things no tactically rational agent would do, and coming out the other side. Charging entrenched positions because the sound of the weapon's fire felt, in some neurological back channel that predated language, like something other than danger. Moving through environments saturated with lethal neurosuppression fields. Technology specifically designed to chemically trigger fear responses in any carbon-based nervous system. And reporting that the suppression field tasted weird, but hadn't produced fear because there was something underneath the fear in those people that the Vethel's instruments simply were not designed to measure. Mendes brought her data to her commanding officer, who told her to rerun the analysis with a corrected baseline. She reran it. Same result. She brought it back. He told her the sample size was insufficient. She expanded the sample. Same result. She brought it back a third time, laid it on his desk with both hands flat on either side of it and said, "Sir, I think we have been looking at our casualties wrong. I think some of what we're classifying as psychological defects in our soldiers are actually resistances." He looked at the data for a long time. "How many?" he said. "Currently identified, 7. I think there are more we haven't found yet." "And you want to put them together, give them a mandate, let them operate without doctrine." She paused. "Sir, the Vethel are fighting us using the humans they've modeled. I want to give them humans they haven't modeled." The commanding officer was a decorated veteran of 3 conventional wars. He had a very orderly mind. He looked at Mendes' data one more time. He thought about 47,000 civilians on 3 occupied worlds. "God help you," he said. "Yes, sir," she said, "probably." Voss met the other 6 at a decommissioned university campus outside of the 3rd major settlement zone on Europa Station. The building still had lecture halls and whiteboards and desks bolted to the floor in rows. Someone in logistics had a sense of humor. The call sign was already on the briefing folder when he arrived. "Schoolhouse." He sat in the front row of the lecture hall and looked at the 6 strangers who would, over the following months, become the only people he'd ever trust with his back in a dark room. There was Sierra Mackin, who had 3 separate discharge recommendations in her file and who had spent 9 years in and out of psychiatric care before the war. She had a quality of absolute stillness in moments of stress that made the people around her feel she'd already seen the worst of it and lived. She had. When the briefing officer asked her to describe her primary psychological challenge, she said, "I don't experience threat as threat. I experience it as a problem." The briefing officer wrote something down and did not make eye contact with her again. There was Dmitry Kasarov, who had been court-martialed twice and returned to service both times because nobody else could do what he did. He kept a flask in his left breast pocket and offered it to anyone who sat next to him, which was disarming in the old-fashioned sense. It made you put things down. In the first week on Europa Station, he mapped 3 separate Vethel surveillance grid patterns that their own intelligence division had missed, and when asked how he'd done it, he shrugged and said, "They're too consistent. Any system that consistent has holes. You just have to stop looking for what they want you to find." There was Io Adebio, who had been medically separated for anxiety-related performance issues, and who, it turned out, processed anxiety as data. Her internal noise floor was so elevated that external threat signals registered as barely distinguishable from her baseline. She was never calm. She was always calm. The distinction mattered. There was Piotr Walczak, who said almost nothing and who had a habit of humming to himself during field operations, a tune his grandmother had taught him, an old song from a country that no longer existed in the form he'd learned it, and who moved through contested environments with a kind of serene inattention to his own safety that had, on 4 documented occasions, resulted in him simply walking past Vethel ambush positions that had been specifically designed to trigger the fear-flight-freeze cascade in human nervous systems. He triggered none of them. The ambush units had watched him hum past and not filed an engagement report because they had assumed something was malfunctioning in their own targeting systems. There was Tomoko Inao, who had a rage disorder and a psychology assessment that used the phrase disproportionate response to perceived injustice 3 times in 4 pages, and who had once, in a documented incident on the Martian perimeter, walked into an active Vethel forward position and told the unit commander, in broken but functional Vethel trade tongue, that it could either leave or she would be forced to do something that would embarrass them both. The Vethel commander had filed a threat assessment and flagged her as a Category 9 anomaly, which was the highest threat rating in their system, and then retreated. And there was Jonah Reyes, who had been in a psychiatric facility for 6 months following a complete psychological break during the siege of the New Bremen habitation ring, who had emerged from that break with something that the attending physician had cautiously described as a significantly restructured relationship with the concept of personal risk. Jonah carried everything lightly: gear, expectations, the future. He could describe, in clinical and accurate detail, exactly how likely it was that any given course of action would result in his death, and then he would do it anyway, not from bravado, but from what seemed to be a genuine assessment that the alternative was worse. He had the best survival record in the unit. Voss looked at these 6 people in the lecture hall and felt, for the first time since the invasion began, something close to peace. These were his people, not because they were like him exactly, but because they were all, in their various ways, the product of something the Vethel didn't have a model for. Human beings who had already survived their own version of the worst thing and come out the other side rearranged. Major Mendes stood at the front of the lecture hall. She put both hands on the podium in the way she always did when she was about to say something she'd thought about for a long time. "The Vethel Empire," she said, "has the most sophisticated psychological warfare apparatus in the known galaxy. They have been refining it for 1100 years. It works on every sentient species they have encountered. They modulate environmental cues, neurochemical exposure, sensory suppression, and predictive behavioral modeling to produce, in their targets, precisely the fear and disorientation that makes armies dissolve." She paused. They have never encountered a species that had already done that to itself. Nobody laughed, but there was a quality in the room that was very close to laughter's twin. "You are not going to outfight the Empire," Mendes said. "You are not going to outmaneuver it or out-resource it or out-doctrine it. What you are going to do is something their models cannot predict, because their models assume rational actors responding to quantifiable stimuli. You are not rational actors responding to quantifiable stimuli. You are people who have spent years in the dark and learned its geography." She looked at each of them in turn. "That is your weapon. Figure out how to use it." The first operation was a reconnaissance insertion into a Vethel processing facility on Kepler C, a moon that the Empire had classified as a strategic supply depot, and the humans had classified as a place where 40,000 civilian prisoners were being held in conditions that Voss, reading the intelligence report, had to put down twice before he could finish it. The facility was considered impenetrable by every standard military analysis. 12 kilometers of approaches covered by overlapping suppression fields, automated systems that tracked heat signatures and movement patterns. Vethel garrison of 800. 3 redundant communication systems that would call for reinforcement within 4 seconds of any detected incursion. Schoolhouse went in on day 3 of a 3-week window. 7 people, personal weapons, minimal gear, No heavy support. The plan, such as it was, had been developed in a lecture hall with whiteboards and had involved a great deal of arguing and at least one moment where Tomoko had stood up from the table, walked to the window, breathed for 30 seconds and then walked back and said, "Fine, but we are doing the third phase my way." The third phase, which involved Tomoko, 2 signal disruption devices, and an approach through the suppression field that Vethel protocols classified as physically impassable for human biology, went exactly the way she'd said it would. The suppression field, a dense envelope of neurochemical modulating M radiation calibrated to trigger panic responses in human neural tissue, hit all 7 of them the moment they entered its range. Voss felt it as a cold pressure behind his eyes and a sudden certainty that everything he had ever done was wrong and the walls were closing in. His threat response training kicked in and he breathed through it. But it was Pieter who surprised him. The man was humming that old song, moving steadily through the field as though it were fog, not weapon, his face entirely absent of urgency. The hum carrying in the dark like something that had no business being there and didn't care. "It's louder on the left," Io said quietly. She was mapping it, reading it as data, not experience. "There's a gap approximately 8 meters wide at bearing 273. They've calibrated for human baseline fear thresholds. They haven't calibrated for this." This meaning people whose baseline was already the inside of the field. People to whom the suppression field was, in a neurological sense, familiar. Sierra moved to bearing 273 and did not hurry. That stillness of hers, the absolute refusal to move at threat speed, was what got them through. The automated tracking systems were calibrated, Dmitri had predicted, to the velocity of human panic. They had not been calibrated for 7 people walking into a maximum security alien installation, the way you walk into a room you've been in before. They extracted 19 intelligence assets, destroyed the facility's communication architecture, and were gone before the garrison completed its first internal security sweep. In the after-action debrief, Voss wrote 3 sentences in his report: suppression field effective on baseline human neurology, non-baseline personnel unaffected, recommend expanded deployment. Major Mendes read the report, called him on a secure channel and said, "How are you?" "Functional," he said. "Callum." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm okay, Major, I mean it." "Good," she said, "because I need you to do it again, except bigger." The bigger one was Hydra Station, a Vethel command node in the asteroid belt that controlled the suppression field network for an entire theater of operations. Take it down, and 3 invasion fronts lost their psychological warfare coverage simultaneously. Every conventional military analysis said it was a suicide mission. The station was hardened, staffed by Vethel shock troops, and embedded with their most senior battlefield psychologist, a figure designated in their intelligence files as the architect, who had personally designed the neurosuppression protocols that had killed the human offensive in the Kepler belt 6 months earlier. Voss and his unit spent 8 days planning. On the 3rd day, Jonah sat across from him in the lecture hall. It was always the lecture hall, back in the university buildings, because something about the rows of bolted-down desks made it feel like the world still intended to teach you something, and spread a hand-drawn map across the desk and said, "Here's where I think we die." "Okay," said Voss. Jonah pointed to 3 choke points in the station's internal geography. His finger moved without hesitation. The tremor that had been in his hands 6 months ago was gone, or rather it had become something else, something so integrated into his movements that it no longer read as instability. Here, here, and here. That's where their defensive doctrine puts the maximum concentration of suppression emitters. That's where a standard incursion force breaks. The field density in those corridors is high enough to induce acute disorientation in any human with a functioning limbic system. "Right," Voss said. Jonah looked at him, something quiet in his face. "We are still the people they haven't modeled," he said, But Callum, the architect, modeled Kepler. See, they've been studying us since the facility breach. They know something is wrong with how we process the field. They've upgraded it. How much? Enough that Pieter's going to feel it this time. Voss was quiet for a moment. Outside, through a window that faced the Saturn side of Europa Station, the gas giant was doing what it always did, enormous, indifferent, lit from within with storm bands that had existed for longer than human civilization. He looked at it. Then we feel it, he said. We felt things before, that's kind of the whole point. Jonah nodded. He folded the map. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out a battered audio player and put it on the table between them. Pieter's going to need something. I know, Voss said. I already asked him. Pieter had said yes. He had also said, with the particular economy of a man who did not waste words, tell Jonah it does not matter how loud the field is. I have been in louder places. Ringkal put the stylus down. Pause, the assessor said. Voss paused. You are describing a tactic, Ringkal said slowly, that relies on psychological damage as a strategic asset. Yes. The suppression fields were specifically designed to be inescapable, without pharmaceutical countermeasures. For most people, yes. Ringkal's 4 optical lenses adjusted in sequence, the way they did when it was processing something that didn't fit a prior category. Voss had noticed this in the first hour of the debrief. The assessor was a very good interviewer by any standard he could apply, but it kept running into the same wall. It had a model for human psychology that was built on what humans were supposed to be, and he kept describing what humans actually were, and the two things were not the same. The architect of the Hydra station, Ringkal said, you engaged it directly. Eventually, Voss said, that's the part you really want to hear about. Yes. He looked at the recording device on the table between them, a small lens, red light. He wondered, not for the first time, how many people on the other side were watching this debrief in real time. Senior Command Staff, War Council, the architects of the imperial strategy that had, 11 months ago, been absolute in its confidence. He thought about Dr. Osai, about her saying in their 6th session, the thing that had stayed with him. You don't not feel fear, Callum. You feel it in a register that other people experience as something else. You've been through enough that fear tastes like information to you, rather than a stop signal. He had written it down that day, not because he was sentimental, because it was tactically useful. The architect, he said, right, okay. Hydra Station fell on the 41st day, after Major Mendes first briefed the expanded operation. The 7 of them went in through a maintenance conduit that had been marked as inaccessible in every Vethel security sweep for 2 years, because it passed directly through the highest density suppression field emitter cluster in the station. The logic of the marking was sound. No human being with a healthy threat response system would willingly enter a corridor that hammered them with neurosuppression radiation at point-blank range. They entered it. It was the hardest thing Voss had ever done, and he had done things that he still woke up seeing at 3 in the morning. The field hit all of them simultaneously, and the effect was not subtle. He felt the world go sideways. Not a metaphor. His vestibular system genuinely tilted, the walls seeming to contract, a cold and absolute conviction settling over him that he was going to die here and had always been going to die here, and that the question of surviving had always been an illusion he'd maintained out of stubbornness rather than probability. He breathed through it. Beside him he heard Pieter humming. It was almost inaudible under the electromagnetic buzz of the field emitters, but it was there, that old song. Something that had existed before this war, before this station, before the Vethel had ever turned their instruments toward the 3rd planet from a yellow star and decided humanity was something they could quantify. He heard Io, her voice flat and precise. Emitter array at 050. There's a pattern irregularity at 3-meter intervals. They've calibrated for human panic velocity. Standard corridor traversal under duress, 12 seconds. We need to walk it in 30. 30 seconds in a suppression corridor at point-blank range. Walk, Voss said. They walked. Every nerve in his body was screaming with a message that predated language. Wrong, 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 danger, stop, wrong. He cataloged it. He noted the frequency and intensity and the specific flavor of the wrongness, and he put one foot in front of the other. Behind him, he could hear Jonah breathing in a specific pattern, 4 counts in, hold, 4 counts out, that Jonah had taught himself in the psychiatric facility, and used now the way other people used weapons. Sierra didn't make a sound. She was the first through to the far end of the corridor. She was standing in the operations corridor on the other side when Voss emerged, her hands loose at her sides, her face entirely still, as though she'd simply stepped from one room to another. Garrison contact in 60 seconds, she said. Left corridor, 4 units. Where's the architect? Voss said. Central Operations Hub, alone. Monitoring the suppression grid. He thought about that for a second. Alone. The most sophisticated psychological warfare specialist in an 1100-year empire, sitting alone at a monitoring station because nothing had ever gotten this far before. Sierra, you and Tomoko take the garrison. Don't engage the architect. That's your job, Tomoko said from behind him. That's my job. The architect was called Vethmyrel, and it looked up from its monitoring station when Voss came through the door, alone, unhurried, his weapon holstered, with the specific expression that Voss had come to associate with moments when the Empire's very long and very confident winning streak ran into something it hadn't anticipated. The suppression field inside the central hub was maximal. Voss felt it like a second skin of cold. He was aware, at a neurochemical level he couldn't fully articulate, that this was the source. That everything that had killed the human offensive in the Kepler belt, everything that had broken 4 battalions and 3 fleet engagements, and turned what should have been a war of attrition into a rout, was being generated and managed from the systems that Vethmyrel's fingers rested on. He crossed the room and sat down across from it, the way you sit across from someone in a therapist's office, the way you sit when you've decided to be honest. Vethmyrel looked at him for a very long moment. Then it said, in perfect translated standard, "You should be incapacitated." "I know," Voss said. "The field density in this hub is considerable." Yeah, he looked at the monitoring screens, all 7 operational sectors of the suppression network showing as green. In about 4 minutes, when Dmitri finished with the relay station in the maintenance bay, they were all going to show as something else. "Can I ask you something?" Vethmyrel was very still. It had the look of someone recalibrating rapidly and doing it well. "You designed the suppression protocols," Voss said. "You've been studying us since Kepler C. You upgraded the field specifically for our neurology." "Correct. And it almost worked." Something shifted in Vethmyrel's posture, not pride exactly, something more like the professional acknowledgement of a fellow craftsperson. "Your unit's psychological profiles were unlike anything in our models. We had to develop an entirely new classification framework." "What did you classify us as?" A pause. "Damaged, but functional. We categorized your resistance to the field as a symptom of severe psychological injury that happened to produce a tactical advantage." Voss nodded slowly. "And what's your model for why we kept coming?" Vethmyrel was quiet. "Because here's what I think," Voss said. "I think your model assumed that damaged means diminished, that something broken is something weaker. You built your whole tactical architecture on the idea that fear, properly applied, makes any organism smaller." He looked at the architect. "We've had 1,000,000 years of being afraid of things. We've had 1,000,000 years of being broken by things and having to figure out how to keep going anyway. Fear and damage and despair, those aren't stops for us. They're inputs. We've been metabolizing them our entire existence as a species. You were trying to pour water into a vessel that had already learned to drink. The monitoring screens shifted, green going amber, amber going red. Veth Myro looked at the screens, looked at Voss. There was something in its expression that he hadn't expected to see, not fear, not anger, but something that might have been in its own alien register recognition. You came here to tell me this, it said. I came here to shut down the grid, Voss said. I told you this because you asked. He stood up. Your field is down, your garrison is contained. My people are going to start sending access codes to the resistance networks in 6 minutes, which means the occupied fronts get their psychological warfare coverage back, which means your offensive in those sectors collapses. He paused. The ceasefire terms are already drafted. You can accept them or we can do this again. You would do this again. We do this every day, Voss said very simply. That's the thing about us. We don't have an option to not do this again. We don't have the luxury of assuming things will eventually be okay if we just wait them out. We've never had that luxury, not once in our entire history. We just wake up and do it again. He looked at Veth Myro. That's not heroism. That's just the shape of what we are. There was a moment afterward, in the corridor outside the central hub. The garrison was contained. The grid was down. Jonah had his hand pressed against a wound on his upper arm that was bleeding significantly but not dangerously, and he was doing the breathing thing, 4 counts in, 4 counts out, his face tilted slightly upward as though he was looking at something only he could see. Voss came and stood next to him. Didn't say anything. After a minute, Jonah lowered his gaze and looked at the floor, and then looked at Voss, and the corner of his mouth moved in the way it sometimes did. We're alive, Jonah said. Yeah, Voss said. Again. Again. Jonah was quiet for a moment. Then, I think I'm going to call her when we get back. Yeah, Voss said. She's been trying, every month. Message, no reply. Message, no reply. I don't know why he stopped. Pressed the back of his hand against his arm, feeling the wound. I think I was afraid that if I talked to her, it would mean what happened to me was real. And if it was real, it was something she had to carry too. Voss thought about Cherry, about Jonah's fiancée, who had been there before the break and after it and who had never, in any of the documented record, given up. He thought about what it meant to forgive someone for disappearing inside themselves when the world got too loud. She already carries it, he said. That's not something you get to protect her from. Jonah nodded. The corner of his mouth moved again, wider this time. You sound like my therapist. My therapist said something similar, Voss said, before the war. Yours too, huh? Mine too. Pieter materialized from the corridor behind them, unhurried, already cleaning his weapon. He looked at Jonah's arm, said nothing, then produced a field dressing from a pocket and handed it over with the economy of someone who has done this before, and before, and before. Sierra came out last. She stopped in the corridor and stood very still for a moment, the way she always did in the immediate aftermath, as though re-establishing the boundaries of herself after having been very far away. Then she looked at all of them, Voss, Jonah with his arm bandaged, Pieter, and in the middle distance Dmitri already composing his after-action notes with a data stylus and Io reviewing frequency captures with her head bowed, and Tomoko sitting with her back against the wall, eyes closed, hands open on her knees. We should move, Sierra said. Give them a minute, Voss said. She looked at him, considering. Then, okay. And she stood beside him in the corridor while the suppression field generators powered down one by one around them, each shut-off audible as a change in frequency rather than a sound, a lightening of the air, and somewhere in 3 occupied theaters of war, 47,000 people breathed a little easier without knowing why. One more question, Rainkal said. Voss had been looking at the ceiling again. He brought his gaze down to the assessor's quadrant of optical lenses. In the central hub, Rankal said, you sat across from the architect. You did not need to do that. The tactical objectives were achieved before you entered the hub. What was the reason for the direct confrontation? Voss thought about it. Not about whether to answer. He'd already decided to be honest all the way through, because the alternative was a lie that left the Empire uncertain, and uncertainty had cost enough lives already on both sides. He thought about how to say it accurately. Dr. Osei, he said, my therapist back before the war. She used to say that the most important thing a person can do when they've been through something that broke them in some way is to resist the temptation to protect the people around them from knowing about it. He paused. She meant it about personal relationships, but it applies. He looked at Rankal. The architect built its weapons out of a wrong assumption about what damage does to people. I wanted it to understand the correct assumption, not because I was angry at it. Because if we're going to have a ceasefire, I'd rather you understood who you made a ceasefire with. Rankal's stylus was still, its optical lenses adjusted. When it spoke again, its synthesized voice was doing something approximating careful. What would you have us understand? Voss leaned forward in his chair for the first time in 3 hours, his elbows on the table, looking at the assessor with the directness that Dr. Osei had spent 8 months drawing out of him, and that had, in the end, turned out to be the thing that made him useful in ways no one had anticipated. You came here thinking fear was your weapon, he said. You have 1100 years of proof that fear dissolves armies, destroys cohesion, ends civilizations. You're right, it does. Fear does all of those things. He paused. But we've been afraid so long we started using it. We have entire cultural traditions built around the experience of being terrified and continuing anyway. We have songs about it. We have religions about it. We have literature, thousands of years of literature. That is essentially the project of human beings trying to look at the worst things that can happen to them and find a way to keep going. You tried to use our own fear against us, and what you didn't know, what your models couldn't account for, is that we already had the fear. We already had it. You just showed up late. The room was very quiet. We are not afraid of you, Voss said. I want to be clear about that. We are afraid. We're afraid of what you can do, what you've done, what you might do. Fear is in our nervous systems the same as anyone else's, but we've been in relationship with our fear for a very long time, and that relationship is complicated and close. And in the right people, the kind of relationship that produces something you clearly didn't model for. He sat back. That's what I wanted the architect to know, he said. That's what I want you to know. He looked at the recording device, at the red light that meant people were watching. Whatever box you were going to put us in after this debrief, make it bigger. The ceasefire held. It was not peace, not fully, not yet, and everyone involved understood that what had been built was a pause rather than an ending, a mutual agreement to stop counting the dead long enough to count the living. There would be negotiations. There would be years of careful movement through the architecture of what had been destroyed and what might be rebuilt. There would be mornings that felt like peace and evenings that didn't, and nights that were what they'd always been, which was dark and uncertain and requiring of a certain resolve to see past. Major Mendes was promoted and promptly transferred to a desk job, which she took on the condition that she could keep the university campus operational. It stayed open. The lecture halls kept their whiteboards and their rows of bolted-down desks, which suited her fine, because the war had proven what she'd suspected. The most important lessons happened sitting down. Jonah called his fiancée. She answered on the first ring. He told her he was sorry for disappearing. She told him she'd known where he'd gone and had been waiting for him to come back. She said she'd learned something while he was in the dark, that you can't carry someone out of a place they aren't ready to leave, but you can stand at the edge and keep the light on, and sometimes that's enough. He thought it was the most accurate thing he'd ever heard. Peter went home to a house that needed the roof repaired and spent 3 weeks in the particular silence of someone who has been very loud on the inside for a very long time and is now grateful to be somewhere quiet. He worked on the roof alone each day and hummed while he worked, and it was, in the context of everything, an act of small and absolute defiance. The proof that certain songs outlast the worst things that can happen, that they persist in the mouths of the people who learned them, and that persistence is its own kind of victory. Tomoko accepted a commission in the post-ceasefire liaison corps, and spent the following years in the uncomfortable and essential work of explaining human beings to alien bureaucracies that kept trying to sort them into the wrong categories. She was very good at it, partly because she had always been very good at recognizing when someone had the wrong category, and partly because she had a very specific kind of patience for situations where the correct response was not to be calm, but to be so comprehensively sure of your position that the room eventually caught up. Sierra went back to something quiet, something with a fixed address and a garden. She wrote Voss 2 letters in the first year after the ceasefire, actual letters, handwritten on physical paper, an act of such deliberate anachronism that he had to sit with them in a certain way before he could read them. The first said, "I think we were the right people for the wrong job, which became the right job." The second said, "I'm doing okay, I think I mean that." Io continued to generate data from everything around her. She was constitutionally unable to stop, which meant she was constitutionally unable to stop learning. She published 3 papers in the first year after the ceasefire, 2 on human neurological variability under suppression field exposure, and 1 on what she called asymmetric psychological baselines, which became required reading in the reconstituted military doctrine program, and which was, she noted in the introduction, the product of having spent 18 months operating in environments that treated her primary psychological challenge as a tactical advantage. She thanked Major Mendes in the acknowledgments. She thanked everyone. Dmitri disappeared for 6 months, and then sent Voss a message from the outer belt saying he was doing consulting work for a salvage operation, and that the flask was still in his breast pocket, and that one day he was going to tell a story about all of this, and it was going to be a very strange story but probably accurate. Voss sent back a message that said, "Don't change anything." Dmitri sent back a single character that, in the emoji lexicon of their particular era, signified something between a salute and a raised glass. Voss went back to Dr. Osei. He sat in her waiting room again. Different chair. No emergency broadcasts on the wall screens, just late afternoon light coming through the window at an angle that made everything look like the last scene of something. She found him there and sat down beside him and looked at him the way she always looked at him, which was the way you look at someone you've been thinking about for a long time. "Well," she said. "Yeah," he said. "How are you feeling?" He thought about it honestly. "Like it's over," he said, "and also like things that are over are still things that happened, and also like," he paused. Outside the window, the light was doing something particular on the far edge of the settlement, making it look like a beginning. Like that's okay. Like having a history doesn't mean you're trapped in it. Dr. Osei took her glasses off her forehead and cleaned them on her sleeve. "Callum," she said. "Yeah. I want to continue our sessions." "I know," he said. "That's why I came back." She nodded. Not with professional satisfaction, something quieter and more real. "You did something remarkable," she said, "out there." "We did something that had to be done," he said. "There's a difference." "Is there?" He looked at the window, at the light. "I think the remarkable part," he said slowly, "isn't what we did, it's that we were already there, when it needed doing. We were already the shape of the thing that needed to exist." He paused. "All those years, all that dark, it was, I don't know, maybe it wasn't wasted after all." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in the voice she used when she was saying something she'd been working toward for a long time, "It was never wasted. It was formation. He sat with that. He thought about Peter on a roof somewhere humming. He thought about Jonah's fiancée keeping the light on. He thought about the architect's face in the moment of recognition, that alien expression that had looked, if he was being honest, like the beginning of understanding. He thought about all the things that had to break in him to make room for what he had needed to become. And for the first time in longer than he could precisely track, the inventory of that breaking did not feel like loss. It felt like the starting point. Outside, the light went on doing what light does. The settlement went on. The war went on being over, one day at a time, which was the only way anything that was over ever stayed that way. And Callum Voss sat in the waiting room with his wrists on his knees and his hands loose, and breathed the air of a world that was still here, because 7 people had walked, unhurried and unafraid in the ways that mattered, into the places that were supposed to make them stop. He was, by any clinical measure, a man with a complicated history and a non-standard relationship with threat, and a file full of the kind of language that usually meant something had gone wrong. Something had gone wrong, more than once, in more ways than he could count. But the Vethel Empire, with all its instruments and all its centuries of psychological precision, had made the oldest mistake in the long history of underestimating the people whose lives had made them hard. It had looked at damage and seen weakness, when what it was looking at, if it had only known how to read it, was a species that had been practicing this exact moment for 1,000,000 years. Earth hadn't sent generals. It had sent the people who had already survived themselves. The Empire had stood in disbelief, and the debrief room smelled like recycled air and burnt polymer, and the recording light blinked red, and the assessor was still writing, and somewhere in the outer belt Dmitri was raising a flask to nothing in particular except the ongoing and improbable fact of being alive. That was enough. That had always been enough. It was, in the end, the most human thing of all. The Vethel War Council reviewed the debrief in full session 3 days after Renkal filed its report. The session lasted 11 hours. It was, by all accounts that later filtered through intelligence channels, the longest uninterrupted deliberative session in Imperial recorded history, which itself spanned 900 years of meticulous archival practice. The report was classified at the highest possible tier. It was also, within 8 weeks, the most widely circulated document in the Imperial Psychological Directorate's entire library, not because someone leaked it, because the War Council ordered its distribution. The order came with a single line of explanatory notation attributed to the Council's first chair. "We have been fighting the wrong war because we were studying the wrong data. Distribute, discuss, do not repeat this error." Renkal, in its post-debrief summary, had written, "The human unit designated schoolhouse does not represent an anomaly in human psychology. It represents the visible end of a spectrum that exists throughout their population. What we classified as pathology, they have been classifying, increasingly, as variants. What we designed as a weapon against their fear, they have been, for generations before our arrival, repurposing as fuel. Recommendation: cease all neurosuppression deployment. Current field technology is not effective against the segment of the human population most likely to be encountered in contested theaters, and its deployment serves primarily to identify to that segment the location of our most significant tactical infrastructure. Further recommendation: do not, under any circumstances, attempt to model the full range of human psychological response. The variance is too high, the adaptability is too rapid, and the particular quality that makes the most resistant among them resistant is precisely the quality that would be destroyed by any attempt to contain or normalize it. The humans are most dangerous when they have been through the most. This finding has no strategic countermeasure within current imperial doctrine. The Council's 11-hour session had been, in significant part, a very controlled argument about whether to accept that last line. They accepted it. Voss didn't know any of this when he was having his third session with Dr. Osai after the ceasefire. He found out 6 months later, when a Vethel diplomatic courier delivered a data package to the Human Diplomatic Liaison Office addressed, specifically, to Lieutenant Callum Voss, 7th Asymmetric Operations Group, Schoolhouse. Inside the package was a translation of Renkal's report, and a note in the assessor's precise translated standard that read, "You asked us to make the box bigger. We have instead removed the box. I thought you would want to know." Voss read this sitting at the kitchen table in the small apartment he'd rented near the university campus. He read it twice. He put it down. He picked up his comm unit and sent a message to Jonah, which said, "You need to read something." Jonah messaged back in 4 minutes, "On my way." He was married by then, which meant he arrived with 2 cups of coffee, and the unhurried quality of someone who had enough to come back to that leaving was no longer something he tested himself against. He sat across from Voss and read the note and read the summary of the report, and then he sat with his coffee going cold between his hands and was quiet for a while. "We removed the box," he said finally. "Yeah," Voss said. Jonah looked up. "That's what we went to therapy for." Voss stared at him. He stopped. "That's not." "I'm just saying." Jonah took a sip of coffee. "Dr. Osai, all those years, working on your relationship with the box, with how you'd been put in it, with how the whole world tried to make you fit in it." He tilted his head slightly. "And then you walked into an alien command hub and told the most sophisticated psychological warfare specialist in the galaxy the same thing she told you." Voss opened his mouth, closed it. "Remove the box," Jonah said. The room was quiet. Outside, through the window, the settlement was doing its unremarkable early morning routine. Foot traffic, service vehicles, the ordinary continuous noise of a civilization that had survived something and was busy getting on with things, which was, when you thought about it, the most extraordinary thing it could possibly be doing. "I should tell her that," Voss said. "You should absolutely tell her that," Jonah said. The session with Dr. Osai where Voss told her was the 9th session after the ceasefire and the 43rd of their total time together, which she had been counting, and he had not. Though when she mentioned the number, he found it produced in him a feeling he didn't immediately have a word for and eventually identified as gratitude. Not the performed kind, not the kind you produce because gratitude is appropriate, but the actual kind, the kind that lives in the body as a warmth rather than a thought. He told her about Jonah's observation. She listened the way she always listened, with the particular quality of attention that had taken him 3 sessions to stop finding unnerving and another 3 to begin actively seeking out. When he finished, she cleaned her glasses on her sleeve. Put them back on her forehead. "Do you know," she said, "what I wrote in my notes after your first session?" "No." "I wrote, this person has been told repeatedly that the way he processes threat is a malfunction. I believe it is a feature that has not yet found its application." She paused. "I did not predict galactic geopolitics, but the principle holds." He looked at her. "Was that always your read?" "From session 3, yes. Session 1, you were too defended for me to see clearly." "Session 2. You cried," she said, "which was the first indication that you were actually in the room." He had forgotten that. Or not forgotten, the memory was there, but had filed it under things that were embarrassing before he understood what they were. He looked at it now with the different light the years had given him, and found that it was simply something that had happened. A person in an office, crying because they'd been carrying things for a long time in the wrong configuration, and something in the room had shifted the angle just enough that some of the weight found its way out. "You were the first person," he said, "who looked at my file and didn't see a problem." "I saw a problem," she said. "I just also saw that the problem was not yours. The problem was the box." She looked at him steadily. "You kept trying to fit yourself into it, into what the assessment said you should be, into what your discharge papers said you were. I spent 8 months trying to get you to stop. And then an alien empire built a weapon out of the box. And you walked through it, she said. Yes. He thought about Pieter in the suppression corridor, humming. About Sira arriving at the other end as though she'd simply stepped from one room to another. About Io reading frequency signatures the way other people read weather. About all of them, the whole 7, each of them carrying something that the world had told them was damage, and each of them arriving at the exact moment when that thing turned out to be the specific shape of what was needed. It wasn't just us, he said, the whole species. I know, she said. I've been thinking about that since the ceasefire. Since the reports came in. She took her glasses off her forehead and held them between her fingers the way she did when she was thinking carefully. Humanity has been doing this forever, taking what breaks us and making it into something we can use. Every culture, every era, every dark period that got survived and turned into a story and told to the next generation as instruction. We call it resilience when it's small and heroism when it's large. But it's the same thing. The same refusal to let damage have the final word. The Vethel thought they could engineer despair, Voss said. They tried that on a species that has an entire literary tradition about the interior of despair and what you find if you keep moving through it, she said. There was something in her voice that wasn't quite amusement but was in the same register. They picked the wrong target. They didn't know, Voss said. No, she agreed. They didn't know. A pause. That is perhaps the most honest thing that can be said about it. They didn't know, and now they do, and we will have to figure out from here what to build in that gap between what they expected and what we are. Voss sat with that for a while. The afternoon light was doing its thing again, coming through the window at the particular late-day angle that made things look like they were just beginning. He thought that was probably a trick of physics. He also thought that tricks of physics could be true. I want to keep coming, he said. To sessions, I'm not in crisis. I'm not falling apart, I just want to keep. Good, she said, that's the work. The work. The ongoing work. The one that doesn't have a final operation or a debrief or a ceasefire point. The work of staying in relationship with yourself over time. Of not stopping when the acute part is over. She looked at him with the particular quality she reserved for the things she'd been waiting for him to be ready to hear. That is, if you want to know my professional opinion, the work that everything else was preparation for. He nodded. He looked out the window. Somewhere in the outer belt, Dmitri was raising a flask. Somewhere quiet, Pieter was on a roof. Somewhere in a liaison office, Tomoko was explaining humanity to an alien bureaucrat with infinite patience and infinite willingness to push back. Somewhere in a lab, Io was generating data. Somewhere, and he didn't know exactly where because Sira had gone somewhere quiet with a garden and a fixed address, and he respected that Sira was standing still in exactly the way she always stood still, which was the way of someone who had measured the silence and found it acceptable. And somewhere, Jonah was going home to someone who had kept the light on. Callum Voss was in a room with a woman who had spent years looking at the thing the world called damage and seeing something else, something that didn't have a clean word but that had, when the time came, turned out to be exactly what was needed. He sat in the chair. He breathed. He was not the shape the box had called for. He was not what the discharge papers had said he was. He was not the sum of his clinical history or the list of his worst years or the profile that the Vethel Empire had tried to build a weapon against. He was something else. Something that had taken a very long time and a very strange route to arrive at. And that was still arriving, still in motion, still being formed by the things that happened and the conversations that followed, and the ongoing improbable project of being a person in a world that kept requiring more than you thought you had. That was the thing about the dark, he thought. You went in thinking it would end you. You stayed because you didn't have a choice. You came out the other side not intact. Nothing came out intact, but rearranged. rebuilt on different load-bearing walls, capable of things you hadn't been capable of before because those things required exactly the kind of reconstruction you'd undergone. The Empire had stood in disbelief. Of course it had. It had been looking for generals, for hierarchy and doctrine and the organized application of quantifiable force, for something it could measure and countermeasure and categorize and contain. It had gotten 7 people in an old university campus who had spent years in the dark and learned where all the walls were. It had gotten a species that had been having this conversation about fear and damage and persistence and the strange alchemy of survival, since the first human being sat by a fire and tried to explain to another human being what it felt like to be alive in a world that was often very frightening and very hard and also, sometimes, and against all reasonable probability, exactly enough. The light through the window was doing what it did. Callum Voss sat in the chair. The work continued.